Welcome. So my name is Jan, and together with Andrew, I'm going to be talking about the future of brand management with design tokens. And I'm going to kick it off with a bold statement. Managing brands at scale with design tokens is broken. What I mean by that is not the format necessarily, but the tooling around it. So the good news is we'll fix this. We're about to show you a revolutionary new way of managing your brand. After this talk, we hope you will start to think about design decisions in a very different way. And that's a bold statement too, but buckle up, it's going to be a fun ride. So first off, a little bit of background information. We've been building tools around design tokens for the past 4 years or so, including the tool called Figma Tokens, which eventually became Token Studio for Figma, but also other tools such as visualization tools for design tokens, letting you see the relationships between your tokens, or transformators, which are built on top of Style Dictionary to let you transform your tokens to something like CSS variables. And while doing that, we have been in touch with a lot of teams, a lot of designers, engineers, managers of companies of all sizes, and they all wanted to embrace design tokens in their workflows. But they all faced certain flaws. So while design token adoption has grown to the point where I think mass adoption is imminent due to more tools offering support, the concept around it and tooling around it especially needs more work in order for it to scale. So don't get me wrong, the concept is great. It's a way to encapsulate design decisions in a platform agnostic way, and there is many benefits to this. As a quick recap on what design tokens are, what you see on the left is basically a design token in a very simple form. It's a design decision captured in a platform agnostic way, and we do that in the JSON. So this is a token called text default with a value of colors gray 900, which is a reference to another token. And it is of type color. The DTCG, which you see in the background, is a community group which is focused around design tokens, aiming to bring this design token format to life, letting us have one particular format, one source of truth between our design tools. But there are certain flaws that we discovered with design tokens and design token toolage around it, which I'm going to address, especially when talking about larger enterprises, multiple brands, these kinds of scenarios. So the first part of my talk and of our talk is called Things That Don't Work. And I'm just going to dive in. So first off, we are reinventing the wheel over and over again. What I mean by that is we kind of do the equivalent of detached components with design tokens. So you kind of lose all connection when you start a new project, which maybe is based on another project, but you don't really want to keep it in one. So you want to start a fresh project. And that kind of is a problem. Christina, in her blog post, Challenges of Multi-Brand Design Systems, talks about what you will encounter as you try to tokenize a multi-brand environment, where you have these dependencies of your brands, which all kind of relate to one another. And we also see that is a bit of a problem with current tooling, where you kind of have a subpar experience. Christina mentions dependencies of brands. Of our 10 brands, we started with a medium complex one, which had a high priority and was the first to be launched. One would say to now build the MVP version for that first brand that hit the ground running. Others, including me, would say to create the maximum amount of variations from the beginning, if you do not want to refactor everything every time you add a new brand. And this, of course, requires that you look at all brands at all the time. So this concept of dependencies of brands is something that our tooling currently fails to address properly. It's forcing us to painfully manage our brands, and we feel that pain. Or imagine you're basing your work off a UI kit, such as Material UI. You kind of start from a specific version, such as 5.13, and then you apply your own customizations on top of it. But suddenly an update is released, and you probably wait a few months until you update to that one, because you're kind of scared of these breaking changes that appear, because you don't really have this living connection between the tool anymore. In code, you could do this quite easily. You could just install a package, and this would be trivial. You'd install this as a dependency and then keep it connected. So whenever there is an update, you can just update. And of course, if there is breaking changes, you need to address them, but you do this in a more elegant way. And the same is true for CSS, for example, where we can import certain other files, which we can then upgrade with our dependencies. And this would be a nightmare if we didn't have that in CSS. So we need a way to declare dependencies, and we need a way to do that between different projects, allowing us to keep these projects small, such as having a foundations project that is situated between different brands. Next problem is that there is no great way to version our design tokens, leaving us with less confidence shipping updates. What I mean by that, in engineering package managers that let you pin specific modules to a specific version is something that is essential, especially if you want to maintain this kind of confidence. But we don't really have that in design tokens, at least yet, especially when working with sets that should act as a source of truth, as a source library of tokens, and not something that is included in the project itself. For example, you might want to refer to color values that are not defined in the current file, but would rather have this be defined elsewhere. And you want this one file to be versioned from a specific library file, so you don't have to update all the time, but you're in control of when you want to update. The State of Design Token survey from 2022 found that only 54% of design token users are using some form of versioning for their actual tokens. And this number is probably way lower for anything like dependencies because there is no proper support yet. So what we need is a way to import a design token library, and we need a way to make sure that our dependencies do not break when we release a new update. So we need this kind of confidence that we would get. The next problem is there is no built-in way to declare dynamic values. If you ever had to create color scales, such as a gray scale or a blue scale, you used tools such as Leonardo or others, which are great. They kind of allow you to take a base color, create variations of that using certain shades based on user input, resulting in a dynamic and accessible scale. And you really only have to change the base value and some of the inputs. Another example is GitHub's Primer Prism, which lets you do something similar. However, design tokens, as of now, don't really have a concept like that. There is no concept of dynamically generated values and storing these in our design token files. For example, this scale that we see right here is something that could be based on one of these scales, but we won't ever know. And if we wanted to change one of these base values, we would have to recreate everything again, and doing that painstakingly doing that for each and every token. And the same is true for any references we are using. So we are using a token called colors_gray200 in another token called fg.muted, which is a hard reference. But this is a problem when we are talking about context-aware design, where maybe the decision that we see right here is made on a black background. But what if you wanted to make that same decision on a green background? Would you change the whole token, or could the system do that automatically for me? A more configurable approach would let us have these dynamic references. So I could say my context is background green and my theme is dark, and it would then automatically swap out the token itself. But we don't really provide any configuration like that for these dials and levers. Dials and levers is a concept by Yesenia in her book, Expressive Design Systems, that I was lucky enough to watch in person in a talk, in which she shares how UI can be given dials and levers to adjust how brands express. In this example, we see a dial between small and large, or compact to airy. Depending on which scale I'm on, the whole feeling changes. Same can be done with products, where you might have a compact dial, which on the brand side is very airy, but on the more product side, where you need this data density, we are then giving you something that resembles Airtable's in-product experience. And tools such as Shaper have shown how we can apply that concept to actual web pages, making experiencing the web a truly dynamic experience, where we have these dials like units, hues, radius, and all of these kinds of things which influence how we are experiencing the web. So if we really wanted to have these proper dials and levers, we need more than these hard references. Jim Nielsen in his blog post describes how there is a need for a declarative UI. He mentions Utopia, which is another tool that lets you create fluid design, especially for type. And depending on the input, we would get a different output. He says, we say CSS is declarative, but the more and more I write breakpoints to accommodate all the different ways a design can change across the viewport spectrum, the more I feel like I'm writing imperative code. At what quantity does a set of declarative rules begin to look like imperative instructions? In contrast, one of the principles of Utopia is to be declarative and describe what is to be done, rather than command how to do it. And this approach declares a set of rules, such as that you could pick any viewport width, and using a formula, derive what the type size and spacing would be at that size. Or Jeremy Keith in his blog post on declarative design systems explains a more systemic approach to design systems that let you define rules and ratios, but leave the detail of the implementation to the runtime. He says, personally, I think the word system is the important part of a design system. But all too often, design systems are really collections rather than systems. A collection of pre-generated components rather than a system for generating components. The systematic approach is at the heart of declarative design, setting up the rules and ratios in advance, but leaving the detail of the final implementation to the browser at runtime. So we need our design decisions to be more dynamic. We need a more configurable and less rigid way. Next up, the way we've done theming leaves little flexibility in the end. In a recent update in Token Studio, we introduced the multidimensional themes, which let you use more flexibility to kind of compose your themes. You'd have theme, brands, contrast, whatever you want. You kind of can compose these different themes. But in the end, that's just toggles. Instead of this more dynamic UI, all we have is basically toggles to go from A to B. So how do we get there? How do we get to a more dynamic UI that lets me do something like Shaper instead of having these toggles? This, I think, is especially useful for accessibility, but also for branding. And how do we make sure that we are ready for AI? This new world where AI is able to operate, what do we need to look at? If we really want to benefit fully from AI, we need to have a system that lets me define constraints to guide the boundaries AI can operate in. David, in his blog post, "What if a UI could design itself?" says, or explains a world where interfaces are not created in advance by designers, but something that reacts to change. And I find this really interesting. There is the thought of a generative UI, which you can pass in logic, which then takes some configuration, and you get a different output out of that, all custom generated. He mentions, instead of looking at the breakpoints of a device, we're looking at scenarios where the UI can evolve. Do I think with dynamic interfaces, the software might design the interface continually itself? Yes, 100%. I believe this will usher in an age of more customization for the end user and bring a more personalized internet. He also mentions, imagine that in addition to an AI-inspired decision-making that could rewrite the interface based on how you want to experience it. Dynamic interfaces can anticipate user needs and iterate at the speed of feedback. This is the future, and I'm very excited. I'm also very excited about that. That sounds like a future that I want to live in. And we need to advance the way we configure UI and themes. Instead of these toggles that I mentioned before, we need to make it interconnected by dials and levers that we are kind of controlling, driven by constraints. Next problem, our sources span different projects, but we do not offer the tooling. So our sets of design decisions need to be smaller, I would say. They need to be more fine-grained and come with different permissions, because it is a different use case for a different project. Whenever somebody else needs to make changes, they should have the right permissions to do that. But right now, everything is kind of grouped into one. This is especially true in agencies where you're working on client projects and then need to hand over that project to somebody else. But you still want to make sure that you are in control and that you keep that connection alive. So we currently treat design tokens in a multi-brand environment, at least, either as this one blob, as we can see here in this screenshot, which contains all the different brands, but keeps the connection alive. Or we detach and leave no connection between them, but then I could have individual permissions for all of my brands. None of these are perfect, I would say. So how do we make sure that our systems are more resilient? That somebody updating brand A, tokens for brand A, doesn't accidentally break anything in brand B. That should be the goal. And how do we make sure that a freelancer that's working on a branding project is able to hand off the project to their client without detaching from the sources? They should be in control afterwards as well. So what we need is encapsulation of our projects. We need a way to think about brand projects as smaller interconnected systems that let us ship with confidence. And finally, handoff between design and development is still very much manual. That's not a great process. We create dozens of tokens that are tied to components that we would then have to change if something is being renamed, for example. Semantic, but also component tokens are an example of that, where if I would make a change, I would have to come in manually, or I would have to instruct my developer to do that for me. So how can we remove these manual steps? In the Token Studio for Figma plugin, we introduced one concept called composition tokens, which closely mirrors CSS classes, which is a step in the right direction, but it's nowhere near perfect. So what we need is a better way to tie our design decisions to what is applied in code. So overall, there's quite a bit that needs to change in our tooling or in the design tokens itself in order for managing brands at scale something to be fun and also scalable. For example, dynamic values, scales and ramps, releases, and highly configurable theming. All of these things are things that we feel the future should include. So in the future, what we think we should do is what we're going to be showing you. So we're going to show you a world where all our decisions are connected. It's all one big graph of relations, making all of this possible. It's the missing piece to a large-scale design token management that goes beyond simpler themes. So what started out as a tiny plugin that was first shown to a wider audience at this conference 2 years ago is now becoming something bigger than that. It's something that sits at the core of all of our workflows, there when we need it. And it's not replacing tools, it's augmenting them. It's letting them communicate with one another, being a more focused place to accomplish our tasks. And we call this simply Token Studio. It's our standalone solution, not tied to any design tool. It is a new way in how teams convert code, pixels, and stories into brands. And it is also a safe place for a brand to evolve and grow, and where we feel curiosity should reign and confidence give us a safe playground to experiment as well. So with all of our development efforts, this is going to be an open core ecosystem that invites other tool makers to express their interests with open source at its core. It's a place where our design decisions form complex structures that let us create theming that scales, and an environment that welcomes change and gives the safety net to make mistakes. It will also feature built-in transformation tools such as Style Dictionary or others. So before wasting any more time, I would say let's just dive right into a very early demo. Note that this is still very early, but it's the first time that we're ever going to show this to the world. So except anything could go wrong, I hope it doesn't. So let's just dive in. Time for a live demo. I hope this works. That was the wrong one. There we go. All right, so we are in Studio here, and I was just refreshing. Live demo, of course. Something, give me a second, that could be there in a while. All right, there we go. So what we see here is basically our early version of Studio, which lets you log into a platform where you are part of an organization. In this case, I'm part of Acme Incorporated, but we could also have something else. And you could be part of different teams. You could be part of different organizations. We would have fine-grained permissions that let you control who gets access to what. In this case, I'm part of the Acme Inc. project, team, organization. Terming is still something we're figuring out, but we are looking at 3 different projects that I see here. And I want to dive into one of those projects. One is called Foundations. I'm going to dive into that one, which lets me see a few metadata on that one. You can see on the left all we offer for that project itself. And on the top, you also see one of our features, which is going to be branching. So you could have this confidence that you can branch off into a different era. Switching over to design tokens is where I can find my design tokens. I can see that there is 4 sets right here, which don't have a folder structure. I can dive into the first one. I could create new ones. And what we have here is a spreadsheet view of all of our design tokens, which let me see just whatever it is that I've stored there. This is just one of the visualizations that we're thinking about, but we're going to introduce more than that. I could create new tokens, could bulk edit tokens. And in our case, just to quickly demonstrate the process, I'm just going to change a token like that to a black value and save that back, which is then saved in the platform. You would then also be in control of where you want to sync that to, for example, GitHub or GitLab or whatever. Now that I've done these changes, I want to publish this again. So I'm going to hit publish. And one of the important pieces is going to be releases and versioning. So first off, I can see the changes that I made. I can jump back to overview, choose a version, choose between patch, minor, and major. I'm just going to go with a patch release, call this release 2.1.2. The one where we say change a few colors and hit publish, which will then create a release. And I could afterwards just jump to the release as well. And one important thing that we see as part of the platform is transformation to different outputs. So while we don't have that yet, we will have something like it in place as well. So this will automatically generate the outputs for you depending on your configuration. What we have so far, and that is available for everyone already, is you can just click generate output, and that just sends our tokens over to our open source style dictionary configurator, which you can use today as well, which then takes just my tokens and converts them to CSS variables like this. So these would be the tokens that I was having in the platform. So jumping back to my presentation, something in the way there. All right, so none of that is really revolutionary. All you've seen today is a different way to manage what we have today. So it's not really exceptional, I would say, but it's nice. But we promised something that will really ease our lives. And what is going to alter the way we manage our brands is going to be the graph. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew.
Yep, and I'm going to take it from here as soon as I get screen sharing permission. Okay, I hope everyone can see. So to start off, we need to do a little bit of background on what graphs are actually going to solve here. So we want to leverage the power of graphs here to maintain the explosion of complexity that is design tokens. So we need to start out by separating the concerns of design tokens, and we separate into 3 levels. And technically, they're all kind of built on top of each other. They're actually just different graphs with slightly different responsibilities. So to start off with, we have resolvers. Now, resolvers are responsible for handling the routing of tokens to consuming components. If you've been following our announcements, you might have seen our posts on the design tokens working group on GitHub. I don't want to go into the specifics here because the spec is already about 18 pages long. But the primary intention is to efficiently support multi-dimensional themings. Now, resolvers address not only this case, but also a similar problem that we've seen in the wild, which is context-sensitive theming. In this example that you can see, the brand and theme of the card is actually affecting the color of the button inside of it. For web designers, this is the familiar cascading property of CSS that we're all used to. But resolvers address this by allowing you to define a set of rules that determine which tokens are used and which context according to multiple different inputs that we're going to use. Now, resolvers really are actually split into 3 abstract phases. The first is the generation of tokens in some consumable format. Assuming web design for this example, we might generate a CSS file using CSS variables, but it's equally possible to generate a JSON file for a native app, or maybe it's even a different flavor of styling like SCSS or less. The generation could also be eager. We could generate all possibilities up front, or it might be lazy and we just generate as requests come in for a specific combination. But by keeping this idea abstract, we ignore the complexities associated with phase and we focus on the entire system. Now, once we've prepared them, we need to go and retrieve them so that the consuming component has access to it. This, again, could take multiple forms. We might load all the tokens immediately when someone visits a web page. Assuming it's a small enough set, it might be a good idea. Or we might load them on demand as a user navigates through the site and encounters new components. Now, once we've actually retrieved the tokens, that's the actual consumption. But it's not just as simple as loading a token set into memory. Now, we might be dealing with something, say, a fully headless design system. In this case, there may be something like name slots to identify the elements that make up a component, such as a container, a text slot, an icon, something that's been left by the headless design system so that a UI layer can exist on top. Or it might just be that we're dealing with, say, a more traditional design system, but we still need to, say, convert the tokens into a specific naming format that can be ingested by them. Now, where does this concept kind of fit in with existing tool chains? Well, to start with, resolvers aren't really a replacement for tools like Style Dictionary. If we think back to the 3 phases of resolvers, Style Dictionary is really a tool that focuses on the generation phase, and you probably still want to keep it inside of it. Provides a set of defaults for generating the tokens in the different platforms that we want to do. So it's not really going to change. However, it is going to form part of the integration of resolvers, the larger part. Now, while we don't really want to alter anyone's existing pipelines because we know that a large amount of people rely on, say, custom transformations in Style Dictionary, we do want to look forward to how the retrieval and routing could be simplified for production use cases. In this small code snippet, we're kind of showing how simple we want the interface to be as it's exposed to developers. At the top layer, basically, we're defining a series of contexts here, which contain an arbitrary amount of modifiers, which is the term that we use to describe a property in a multidimensional theme. And pretty much that's all we really want to indicate at this layer. Just that a certain modifier needs to be used, and if anything is included inside of it somewhere within the hierarchy that it knows that it's using it. Basically, we're trying to get to the form where we can declaratively say that we're using specific context to handle the routing. Now, let's look at the rest of the code that we're going to connect this to. In a truly headless system, you probably have an existing component library like a Chakra or Simba, and you really want to have your style layer exist outside of the functionality layer. Well, in this case, we envision having adapters that will handle the retrieving and the routing phases, as we mentioned previously. So to explain the few lines of code we see here, we're identifying component context, in this case, a button, which is used to help the retrieval system select the appropriate subset of tokens it needs to get, maybe from a server or from a database, as well as additional modifiers for the retrieval. In this case, the primary button token here, because it's inheriting from the context we saw from the previous slide, is not just going to get the button primary one, it's also going to get the dark theme that we saw because we've applied it on top of it. And also we provide a lightweight wrapping here to bind a small amount of metadata, in this case, element names, which we give to the routing system to handle how the values are actually going to be provided for the components. The final injection, whether it be something like class names, style objects, CSS variables in the shadow DOM or something, is still something that is abstract, and you can kind of choose based on a series of templates that we will give you. But by having both a spec for resolvers as well as some kind of flexible pre-made adapters that we're developing, we're hoping to make the handover process as seamless as possible, as well as scalable. Now, resolvers sound interesting, but what are the generators that sit on top of it? Now, if you see in the spec, the core of resolvers is basically a basic graph under the hood. But if resolvers are concerned about consumption, generators naturally care about the generation. As Jan mentioned, there's no good way really to capture dynamic design decisions, nor to show relations between fundamental design decisions that have happened upstream and where that finalizes itself in the final design. And no one really wants to manage hundreds of semantic layers of tokens. So what we actually want to do is integrate those decisions directly within the token generation as a series of graphs, and also subgraphs that designers can easily interact with in real time to see the decisions. Now, lastly, before we get to the fun part, we want to talk about one more layer above that, which is workflows. Workflows can manipulate and trigger generators to react to events such as newly published releases from dependent token sets. Say you depended on material tokens as a library, scaffolding new tokens, applying changes from feedback in automatic A/B testing system, waiting for sign-off from multiple stakeholders, etc. Workflows are kind of the final piece that handle the full automation of tokens. And it's more than just calling a API itself, it's coordinating a large system amongst it. Now, enough of this. Let's actually go to the fun part that we've all been waiting for. This is our demo that we have available. I'll post the link in the chat, but it's available at resolver.dev.tokens.studio. It is publicly accessible right now, so you can go to it and play along if you want. It currently also is in alpha, so there might be bugs, but that's half the fun of early access. Technically, it's a combination of both generators and resolvers, because we're both going to be generating sets, and there's already a rudimentary routing system going on. Now, Marco will actually be doing a follow-up talk in the conference on some advanced use cases of the graph in action. So I'm just really going to focus on the basics here. So to start with, we've got a series of nodes that we can use to do a whole bunch of calculations. But let's actually get some tokens inside the system. So here's some tokens that I had previously that I've actually exported from Figma tokens, and I'm just going to drag and drop them in place. Whether you use the W3C or our token spec doesn't really matter. You can use either. But here are some tokens we're already playing with. Now, the first thing you can kind of see is it's a bit imperative. We're dealing with tokens that are already like well defined. They've got values associated to them. But really, this is actually something that we can almost treat algorithmically. If we look at these, as long as we have this base 500, actually we can just generate it. So why don't we just do that and represent that as something that we would do? So it is a design decision that needs to be replicated. So if I just say delete these quickly, if I use the green 500 base, I should really just be able to do this. And this relationship between these nodes really just represents the design decision that we want to do. And I can easily manipulate it and add more to it. And if I really wanted to, I can actually just take this, pipe it into another one, and I can actually just copy it to clipboard, or I can download it right now, and I can have the set available to me if I need to use it. So that's kind of fun. We've got some stuff that we want to do, but let's kind of play around a little bit more with it. So let's go look at our pre-made tokens that we had, and let's kind of see some functionality we can do. So we've got blending right now. Blending is actually something that we already have within the Figma plugin itself, and we can just connect it through. But maybe I kind of want this to be a little bit more dynamic so I can see things. Well, let's do that. Maybe I just need to eyeball changes that I need to do. That's interesting again, but is there more? So these are the 4 blends that we currently have. But let's look at the blends that we don't actually have in the tokens, the Figma tokens plugin at the moment. Let's look at some advanced blending, for example. So this is the full spectrum of normal blends that you'd expect to see: overlays, highlights, color dodges. Let's just connect those up quickly. Whoops, sorry. There we go. Let's connect those up, and we're generating colors, and we're actually pulling values out, and we can go through. It's not really something that we could do previously within the tokens plugin just by itself, just because it's very difficult to represent how we're going to do like n possible dimensional inputs and do this type of calculation on top of it. Now, again, it's kind of cool, but maybe we want to go a little bit more dynamic on top of it. So let's actually remove all of this and assume that we don't have any form of pre-made tokens ready at all. In that case, let's play around with the extract node that we have. So I have a fun little image that I found, and I want to extract some of the colors out of it. So in this case, it's failing, but don't worry, this failing is expected. The main reason this is happening is because it's trying to access free picked chord, and there's a cause config that's currently stopping it. So I'm going to turn my cause and blocker on, and then I just force update, and there we go. So we can actually start extracting colors. And again, maybe we want to play around with the sliders or change it directly so that we extract more or less colors. In this case, we can actually start off with getting assets from a brand, and then potentially using that to determine the colors and make dynamic UIs, so we can kind of play around with it before we kind of lock in the decision. The other thing that you might have noted was it was spinning when it wasn't doing the connection. All the nodes actually within this can actually be async. They can depend on external data. Studio itself is going to support branching, immutable token sets for releases, so you can actually rely on other people's stuff. You can rely on your own token sets in different branches. You could rely on, say, having a core set of tokens that your agency provides, then is then used by downstream customers, and you can bring all this power together. Now, these are just a few. Can we do something a little bit more dynamic? Well, yes, we can. Let me just go across the card quickly. I'm going to load an existing generator that I have, and I'm going to do card accessibility quickly here. So in the bottom left, I think you can see this little preview window that we have. This is actually a tied resolver that expects a certain output. But what we're actually doing here is we're taking our token set, and then we're playing around with the slider. We're doing some blends. And then what we're actually trying to do is dynamically decide what colors we want to actually attach to it. So we're using 2 AAG contrast node checks here. And what we're doing is we're checking between black color versus white color, actually, which would be better. And what we can do here is we can play around. At some point, maybe black will win out. And turns out it's all the way at the end. But we can really use this to determine how we want to handle dark mode themes. We might even want to do something like taking a color and then inverting it. Let's just take an arbitrary color again and take this red value. And then we'll just, for the set operation itself, let's just invert it. So we want to create a new set with the exact same naming. And let's just visualize it again, because you don't technically have to visualize it. But we can just invert it around. So if we need to kind of swap back and forth between light and dark theme, it's fairly simple for us to use. It's also very simple for us to do other accessibility checks as well, like introducing color blindness along when we do it. So let's get a quick preview of what someone with Deuteranopia would see. So we can also start trying to integrate things like accessibility directly while we're making tokens, as opposed to this being something where we're actually waiting until a testing phase has occurred before we actually get to it. Now, I mentioned subgraphs as well. let's kind of see an example of why we would use subgraphs in the first place. So let's go here. This is something bad we don't really want to do. I've got some inputs from somewhere, and they're all pretty much exactly the same. And I'm just doing a repetitive task over it. I'm trying to round it to some kind of precision, and then I'm trying to pass a unit on top of it to try to keep it all consistent within a name. But this is kind of terrible. It's not really scalable. And the reasoning being, what happens if there's a new process that's added on top of it? So basically, we have the idea of being able to make sub-generators. These essentially will collapse down into smaller single nodes that can encapsulate a larger design decision. And you just really have to treat it as a black box. So to replicate exactly what they have there is I had some form of input, there's the rounding, the pass unit, and the output. Now, when this gets collapsed into a single node, these values that I place here actually just become a default. If someone doesn't want to pass through a precision, they don't have to. I can use the standard one they have. And if we ever needed to, say, change it, let's say for some strange reason that we wanted to do some clamping, it's as simple as, well, we can just remove this node. We can place it there. And we can just take it in here, and we can maybe set it that we're clamping at 3, and there we go. Instead of repeating this over and over and over, we don't have to worry about it. Now, I'm showing you this is kind of a base example, but we would use this black boxing over and over and over again in larger and larger graphs. So speaking of larger and larger graphs, let's actually look at quite a massive one that Marco has made. And this might have to zoom all the way out for it. So this is quite a huge node that's actually going in place. And what's interesting is we are providing nodes that are actually primitives here. If I zoom in quickly here, I don't know if anyone has a particularly good eye, but you might be able to detect what type of color this is. And actually, if we go all the way to the start here, you can actually see that Marco's actually generated a color generator. He's made it that it's creating triadic, analogous, and complementary colors. And he's cobbled it together from like basic primitive pieces. From here, basically what you could do is just encapsulate this again, and you could share it out. You could actually just be someone on, say, a marketplace that then black boxes loads of reusable components that other people can use. And the other thing is, when it comes to particularly large graphs like this, we also provide a number of additional features to kind of move around with it. One is, well, in a really, really complicated graph, I don't really know what's happening here. Maybe I'm losing track of what's going on. Well, we can also isolate it as well. So here, I just want to see, what does this affect downstream? And you can see here, it's actually graying out everything. And I should be able to follow along to see where it affects and go all the way along. Similarly, I can do the same upstream. We also provide a whole host of other features as well. So here's the exact same graph that I just showed you, but automatically converted in our auto layout. So this is just one of them. This is the DA GRE layout. Might not be what you want, but we have a series of ones that can automatically do it. So if you also just want to keep it conformant because you're working in a particularly large team, well, you can just go onto the graph, make your changes, and then just like we auto format code, we can just auto format your graph back again. Now, time's kind of running out. I wish I could show you all the features. There's quite a lot of them, but I allow you to go play. But the one thing I do want to mention is we don't want there to be any lock-in for the system. So we're actually open sourcing the underlying engine for this graph computation. You can actually go right now to our GitHub and you can download it and play with it, and you can extend off of it. You can actually create your own custom nodes for it. And as well, it's quite a lightweight system as well. So while you might want to do it, we probably don't advise you, but you can if you want to. You could actually just embed this engine directly inside your user's browser experience. So if you allow them to then choose their base fundamental colors, you can recreate an entire design system based still on your same design decisions, but letting them choose the base components that create it. Now, there's loads of other pieces. I just want to also just lastly mention again, the fact that we're representing all of this, and this is a small part, the generators, and there's also the workflows on top of it. But because this is actually then represented in a graph, and we're backing it within a graph database itself, we're also prepping it for AI at a certain point. So because AI can actually see your design decisions, where you've made them, and try to copy it, we also envision a future where basically it learns how you would want to do it. This is how you lay it out. This is the constraints that it's detecting implicitly within your company system. And maybe it's not a Clippy, but next time you go and alter your graph, it actually says, hey, maybe you want to try it this way. Maybe we should make this change. Would you like to do it? Should we get to a point where we're doing automatic A/B testing? And then in a few years, it's automatically updating your site for you. You're just needing to feed it analytics as it goes through. So I think I'm probably getting to the end of the time. And I think it's time to hand back to Jan to run of why the graph configuration is just such a natural fit for tokens overall.
Thank you. So let me dive back into my screen share. There we go. 1 second. Yes, there we are. All right, so oops, that was odd. All right, so I mentioned before that having dependencies between projects is important if we want to manage our projects at scale. And we can solve that now using the graph by declaring a specific version of a project as the source, which is just a node that basically flows in. And then we can use this source library that would then drive all of our tokens and be something that we can resolve tokens with. You could set any UIKit as the source, and we hope to work together with UIKit authors to have these available inside of the tooling in the first place. So updates come automatically. And then you could do your changes on top of it, be notified of updates without ever detaching. Common decisions between brands can be packaged as a source, making these responsibilities clear and easy to extend on. For example, this example from before, where we have brand A, brand B, which both use a foundational source library, we could have that. We could have this in a versioned manner, so each brand team could then decide on their own how and when they want to update. The other thing I mentioned was these dynamic design decisions. And Andrew went into that in great detail now with the node-based UI that allows us to have that. And as I mentioned, we are still early, so a lot of this is still subject to change, but it shows the prospect of where we can go and where we can take this, which is super exciting, I think. So with our graph, we can encapsulate these decisions as switches and inputs at various stages, and that allows us to get dynamic outputs depending on wherever, whatever I want. And this could also be dynamic at runtime, as we mentioned before. So maybe that's something that happens in the browser as our inputs change, as our environments change. On the topic of storing these design decisions, that's something that's very important to us, where we want to make sure that you are in control of where your data is stored. Our open core would really allow that. And we are thinking very heavily on the enterprise scenario there, where you would not be vendor locked in at all, but you could then decide as well. We're also thinking about self-hosted solutions, so this would really work for enterprise solutions. And the last piece is the input-dependent theme configuration, meaning you can have highly configurable resolution of themes, as Andrew just showed. We'd have this inputs that let us define what outputs we get, and you decide what input is needed. Last piece that I want to call out is the ongoing discussion in the DTCG about themes and modes, where everyone could take a read and just chime in. We are also having our own proposal there. This is the link to that one, to the discussion overall. And we have created a dedicated channel for our counter proposal, kind of, where we would encourage everyone to chime in. So what we are presenting is the safe place for a brand to evolve and grow. And you can sign up for early access. We're currently looking for early companies to take part in that. Super excited to have you on board, but keep in mind we're still early, but we would love to have you on board there. So one thing that I wanted to ask from you is, how do you see the future of brand management with design tokens? I would be curious what you feel that future is going to look like, as you've kind of just seen how we see that. I already asked ChatGPT what it thinks the future will look like, and it did not disappoint. So with that, I want to thank you for being there for our talk. So thank you.